This state of play production is made possible by the generous support of Biogen, Biogen, where science meets humanity.
Hi, I'm Sharon Pratt, and as you know, State of Play is exploring the role of African American women in particular in the quest for political equality. And we have the perfect guest, Professor Michelle Duster. She is a professor. She's a public historian. She's an advocate for equity on gender and racial issues. And she is both an author and someone who's collaborated on 12 books. And it all comes naturally to her. It's sort of a genetic calling. She is the great-granddaughter of Ida B. Wells. We are so honored to have with us Professor Michelle Duster.
Well, thank you so much for this honor, Mayor Pratt. I really appreciate being here.
So, as we talk about the role of Black women in particular in the quest for political equality, there are many ways you could comment on it. I mean, you have quite a rich history yourself. But let us begin with your great-grandmother, if we might. People know of Ida B. Wells. They may not know all that they should know about Ida B. Wells. Tell me something a little bit about her life. I do know that she was born when slavery was still operating.
So my great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells, was born enslaved in 1862 in Holly Springs, Mississippi. Luckily for her, the Civil War ended in 1865 when she was only 3 years old. And she had the opportunity to become formally educated at Shaw University, which is now Russ College. And so she grew up during Reconstruction, which was a time of great progress after the Civil War. And she eventually, unfortunately, when she was only 16 years old, her parents both died in a yellow fever epidemic, leaving her and 5 of her young remaining siblings without parents. And she started teaching in order to take care of herself and her siblings. She eventually moved to Memphis, and where she was teaching, but she also became involved in journalism and civil rights activism. And after 3 of her friends were killed, she really started on her anti-lynching campaign, which took her to New York City and England and eventually Chicago. So she spent the better part of her adult life fighting for freedom, justice, and equality. She actually got involved in the suffrage movement later on in her life. So in every way, she was fighting for gender and racial equality.
Sort of want to get a sense of where did all of that energy and drive come from, because it was quite extraordinary for any woman, much less an African-American woman, to be as assertive as she was, because it was Jim Crow when she got so involved, was it not?
It was very dangerous what she was getting involved in. I mean, in fact, her life was threatened. Her printing press was destroyed because she dared to tell the truth about what was going on regarding domestic terrorism. At that time, it was lynching, but there were also quite a few race riots and massacres. So she really felt very strongly that the world needed to know what was happening to this citizens of this country, and extrajudicial killings, murders that were happening with impunity. So she obviously felt it was worth fighting for and even dying for, to fight for first-class citizenship.
So, but her first event, as I gathered from some of what you've done as well, is that when her friend, was it not a friend who had started a store, and he and his colleagues were lynched because it was a threat to the white businessman? Is that the event that sort of triggered everything?
Absolutely. Yes, she had 3 friends. She was closer to Thomas Moss, but she also knew Calvin McDowell and Will Stewart as well. And these 3 men started a grocery store that rivaled a white-owned grocery store, but it was in the Black neighborhood in this area called the Curve, right outside of Memphis. And they were upstanding citizens, leaders in the community. Thomas Moss was also a letter carrier, which was considered a very prestigious job since it was working for the federal government. And so for these three men to be lynched under false pretenses of, of their store was attacked and they defended themselves. So then they were framed as the aggressors and as the criminals. And so when my great grandmother saw this, this lawlessness, and also felt that the law could not work on the side of African Americans, not only because of what happened to her friends, but also because several years before that, she had sued the Chesapeake, Ohio and Southwestern Railroad on the basis of separate and unequal after she had been removed from the ladies' car because she refused to move to a colored car. And she sued the railroad. She initially won, but then the ruling was overturned several years later in the Tennessee Supreme Court. So she felt there was no way, if the law doesn't work on your side, and then the law are the people who are doing the lynching, then there's no way you can get justice. So she started writing in her newspaper, the Memphis Free Speech, about how Black people need to boycott white-owned businesses, boycott the streetcars, and for those who could afford to leave Memphis, to just go, because there was no way they could get justice in this lawless environment.
Well, it still took a lot of chutzpah, as we'd call it, because didn't it take 3 officials to get her off the rail car when she refused to move her seat? Was that not the case?
Right. The train conductor tried to remove her first, and then he couldn't do it. So then he got 2 of his colleagues to help remove one woman. And she was very petite in size. She was around 5 feet tall. I'm assuming around that time. She was in her early 20s, so she was probably in around 100 pounds. So she was a very tiny woman in stature. And for 3 men to feel the need to remove her, this is assault. And her dress was torn. She was publicly humiliated. She wrote about how after she was removed, the people on the streetcar, on the train, cheered. And one of the things that struck me about how she talked about the incident was how Black women who were nursing white children were welcome on this streetcar. But she, as an educated professional teacher, was humiliated. And so, she kind of put the two together, that as long as Black people were in a subservient role or a service-oriented role, they were welcome in these spaces. But you can't be an equal or maybe even superior to some white people and be welcome.
Well, now, when she was bold enough to write about what happened with her friends being lynched, of course, she knew if they lynched them, she had to know they were coming after her. Because she had to give up everything at that point, did she not? And as a result of her courageous move.
Right. Well, after her friends were lynched, she started writing a series of articles in the Memphis Free Speech, that not only encouraged people to boycott white-owned businesses, because she felt strongly that there was no justice through a legal system. So she wanted the white community to be affected economically. And she felt there was no way you could appeal to the moral consciousness of the white community. So you need to appeal to them when it comes to business. And she also exposed the reality that some liaisons that happened between Black men and white women were consensual. And that is really what set off, the death threats, because the narrative at that time was that Black men were violating white women. And so these white women needed to be protected so much from their men that it required Black men to be lynched. And so when my great grandmother exposed the reality that this was really a lie, because the Black men who had been lynched, her friends, were not not guilty of that crime. And so she started looking at how many other people who were innocent were not guilty of that crime of violating white women. And so she put the two together and realized that, and she exposed the fact that lynching was being used as a way of economically and socially disenfranchising Black people. And it was being used as a way to terrorize the Black community. It had nothing to do with crime. It was about social hierarchy, racial hierarchy, and maintaining segregation and a situation where black people would always be at the bottom when it came to social and economic status in this country.
So she also became good friends with Frederick Douglass. I think, did they meet at that fair? Was it that when that happened? Another firebrand of that era?
No, they actually met a few years before. I think it was 1889 that they met at basically like a journalism convention that happened actually in Washington, D.C. And so because she was a journalist and she had developed a national reputation at that time, because even though she was writing for newspapers in Memphis, a lot of her columns or her articles were reprinted in other newspapers around the country. So she had a national reputation, and she met Frederick Douglass at this convention. And he really admired her. There were several other people that she met. In fact, she was voted as secretary of this at this convention. And so Frederick Douglass had a lot of respect for her. And once she wrote this article in 1892 and was exiled from the South, he in fact wrote basically what ended up being the preface for her first pamphlet that she got published when she was in New York City. So by the time they got to the World's Fair in 1893, they had already been friendly. He really acted as sort of a mentor to her because he was around 45 years older than her. And so in a way, he was like a grandfather figure.
Well, many things happened. I mean, she had quite an extraordinary life, but I want to get your thoughts on some contemporary figures, but we cannot ignore that she was a co-founder of the NAACP. Is that correct? And Frederick Douglass introduced her to her husband. Is that correct?
I mean, that's what I've always understood to be the case. I do believe that Ferdinand Barnett, who is my great-grandfather, knew of my great-grandmother. There was no way, I don't think he could have not heard of her. But as far as I know, they didn't meet until 1893 when Ida went to Chicago to work with Frederick Douglass at his request, to work with him on this pamphlet to basically protest the exclusion of African Americans from the World's Columbian Exposition. And so Ferdinand Barnett was one of the 4 people who wrote entries for this pamphlet, and my great-grandmother was the editor and ultimately the publisher, because she raised the great majority of the money to produce the pamphlet. So while she was here in Chicago in 1893, she and my ultimately great-grandfather obviously hit it off, and she worked with his newspaper, The Conservator, which was the first Black-owned newspaper in Chicago. He was also a very prominent attorney and a civil rights activist in his own way. So they had a lot in common, and they just obviously got along, and they got married 2 years later in 1895.
You have also made it your sort of mission. Started off in psychology. I think you said it. I think I saw at Dartmouth, but ended up always having this ability to write yourself and having a real passion about uncovering the truth. You have really focused on African American women and their role. Is there an African American woman now that you think really embodies your great-grandmother?
Well, I mean, in my book, Ida Be the Queen, I mentioned several different current people who embody parts of who my great-grandmother was. I'm not sure if there's any one person who embodies everything, but I mean, for instance, when it comes to voting rights and fighting for political empowerment and representation, Stacey Abrams is absolutely embodies parts of who my great-grandmother was. Also Maxine Waters, Lucy McBath, Sabrina Fulton. These are some of the women who are continuing on with some of the work that my great grandmother was doing. Also, Bree Newsome. I mean, she, when she climbed up that pole in South Carolina and removed the Confederate flag from, from the state property. So there are quite a few women who are doing some of the work that my great grandmother was doing, but she was doing so many different things that I'm not sure if there's anybody doing all of that. But her legacy continues through people today who are continuing on with the work. I mean, another woman that I mentioned in my book was Kamala Harris, who. And she actually recognizes that she's standing on shoulders in order for her to become the first African American, South Asian vice president of the United States.
Well, I've seen someone else ask you this question, but we'll make it the last question. What is the takeaway? What is the lesson that we all should have as a result of a lot of the work that you've uncovered about other African American women, but particularly the outsized personality of your great grandmother, Ida B. Wells? What is the lesson to all of us?
Well, my takeaway about her life is basically just to just speak up. I mean, if you see injustice anywhere, then you can't be silent about it. You have to speak up and do what's within your own power, in your own comfort zone, if you want to put it that way, to do what's right and make sure that people hear about what's going on and put pressure on the system to impact change.
Well, that's a great takeaway. Maybe everybody have as much resolve and courage as did your great grandmother, as do you, in all that you're doing on behalf of other women, as you uncover and share their stories with the American public. Thank you for what you do, and thank you for sharing your insights with us today on State of Play.
Oh, thank you so much, Mayor Pratt.